Sometimes, the hardest part of growing old isn't what you've lost, but what you never managed to understand. For 61-year-old Mira Delaney, that weight had followed her for nearly 6 decades. For $50, she buys an abandoned cave house in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains, carved directly into a cliffside. Forgotten and weathered by time, she hoped to find peace beside a tranquil glacial lake. All she wants is solitude. But beneath the old floorboards, she finds something that freezes her in place. Relics that have no business being there. Items linked to her father, a miner who vanished without a trace in 1964. Strange sounds echo through the cave at night. A carved stone appears, defying all explanation. What began as an escape becomes a reckoning with the past. What really happened to her father all those years ago? Before we return to the story, let us know where you're listening from. And if this tale resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because I have something very special in store for you tomorrow. Mira Delaney had spent 30 years learning to be comfortable with silence. As a park ranger in the Montana wilderness, silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning. The rustle of pine needles told her the direction of the wind. The snap of a twig told her what was moving through the forest. The quality of a bird's song told her if predators were near. She had learned to read the wilderness the way some people read a newspaper. And in doing so, she found a kind of peace that most people spend their whole lives searching for. But retirement was different. The silence in her Missoula apartment was not the productive silence of the mountains. It was just empty. A two-bedroom on the second floor of a 70s-era building, with walls so thin she could hear her neighbor's television through the drywall. She would wake at dawn out of habit, make coffee, and sit at her small kitchen table with nothing specific to do. Her body still kept a ranger's time, but there was no wilderness to patrol, no trails to maintain, no lost hikers to find. She was 61 years old, and she felt every one of them in her joints on cold mornings. Her hands were strong, but weathered, mapped with the scars of decades of outdoor work. Her face was deeply lined, etched by a life spent more in the open air than under fluorescent lights. Her hair was more silver now than brown. She kept it short, practical. She'd never been vain, and age hadn't changed that. Most days, she would walk to the library or the coffee shop on Higgins Avenue, just to be near people without having to talk to them. She had built a life around solitude. And now that she had nothing but solitude, she realized it wasn't quite what she thought it was. There was a difference between choosing to be alone in nature and being alone because there was nowhere else to be. The dreams began 6 months into her retirement. Always the same one. Her father's face, younger than she'd ever really known him. He disappeared when she was 11, so her memories of him were a child's memories. Big hands, a soft voice, the smell of pipe tobacco and earth. In the dreams, he was calling to her from somewhere she couldn't quite see. It wasn't words she could understand, just a feeling of urgency, a sense that he needed her to understand something. She would wake from these dreams with her heart pounding, the dark apartment around her, and lie there trying to grasp details that slipped away like water through her fingers. Her father, Vincent Delaney, had been a mine surveyor. He worked for various companies across Montana, assessing mineral deposits, filing reports, spending weeks at a time in remote locations. Her mother accepted it as part of the job. Mira accepted it, because children accept whatever their parents tell them is normal. Until June of 1964, when he left for what was supposed to be a 2-week surveying job and never came back. The official story was simple. Vincent Delaney had vanished in the wilderness. Search parties found no trace. His truck was located at a trailhead. His camping equipment was gone, but his body was never found. The assumption was that he had fallen, been taken by wildlife, or met some other misfortune in the backcountry. It happened. The mountains sometimes took people and didn't always give them back. Mira's mother, already a fragile woman, withered after that. She died 2 years later of pneumonia, though Mira had always suspected it was really from a broken heart. Mira was sent to live with her mother's sister in Billings, a stern woman who believed children should be seen and not heard. She raised Mira with a sense of duty, but no affection. And the day Mira turned 18, she left for college and never looked back. She had become a ranger partly because she loved the wilderness, but also because a part of her had always believed that if she knew the mountains well enough, she could understand what had happened to her father. She spent 3 decades in the very places he might have died, as if proximity to the wild could somehow bridge the gap between her and the truth. It never did. The mountains kept their secrets. On a Tuesday in September, Mira was sorting through boxes of old paperwork from her days at the ranger station. Most of it was destined for recycling: incident reports, trail maintenance logs, weather data from years past. She was about to toss a stack of old wilderness bulletins when something caught her eye. It was a classified section from a bulletin dated 1963, yellowed and brittle. Someone had used it as backing paper in a file folder, probably decades ago, and it had been preserved by accident. The classifieds were mostly what you'd expect: used gear for sale, help-wanted ads for seasonal workers, land available for lease. But one ad, circled in faded pencil, made her stop breathing. Cave House, Mountain Lake, $50 Inquire VD. Her father's initials, Vincent Delaney. She stared at it for a long time, turning it over in her hands. The bulletin was from 1963, a year before her father disappeared. The ad included a phone number. She called it, expecting nothing: a disconnected line or someone who had no idea what she was talking about. Instead, a real estate agent answered. The property, he said, was still available. It had been for years. Nobody wanted it. Too remote. Too much upkeep. No road access for the last 2 miles. But if she was interested, the price was still $50 for the deed transfer. She should have asked more questions, should have gone to see it first. She should have done a dozen sensible things, but something in her chest seized up when she heard "still available," and she said yes before she could think it through. $50. She paid more than that for dinner some nights. She signed the papers the agent emailed her, wired the money, and became the owner of a place she had never seen. Her downstairs neighbor thought she'd lost her mind. You bought a property in the mountains sight unseen? Mira, that's not like you. But in a way, it was exactly like her. She had spent her entire life making careful, considered decisions. She had built a career on risk assessment and planning. And where had it gotten her? Alone in a silent apartment, watching her life drain away like sand in an hourglass. This felt like the opposite of that. It felt like the kind of decision her father might have made. Impulsive, guided by gut instead of logic. And the initials on that ad kept turning over in her head. VD. Inquire VD. As if the ad itself was a message meant for him, or for her, or for someone who would understand what those initials meant. 2 weeks later, she loaded her old pickup truck with the essentials: camping gear, tools, enough food for a month, her old ranger pack with first aid and survival supplies. She broke her apartment lease, put what little furniture she owned into storage, and drove east. toward the Bitterroot Mountains. The drive took her out of Missoula and south, past Lolo, and into country that grew more remote by the mile. Paved highway gave way to gravel roads, which gave way to dirt tracks barely wide enough for her truck. She consulted the property maps the agent had sent, hand-drawn, decades old, barely legible. But her years in the backcountry had taught her to navigate by landmark and instinct. She found the last turnoff the agent had indicated. The final 2 miles were on foot. She hiked in with her pack, planning to return for more supplies once she saw what she was dealing with. The trail, if you could call it that, wound through old-growth forest. Douglas fir and lodgepole pine with trunks thick and ancient. The undergrowth was dense with ferns and huckleberry bushes. A creek ran parallel to the path, its water clear and cold. And then the forest opened up, and she saw it. The lake was small, perhaps a quarter-mile across, fed by a waterfall that tumbled down the face of the cliff on the far side. The water was that specific shade of turquoise green you only see from glacial melt, so clear you could see the rocks on the bottom 15 feet down. The air smelled of pine and water and stone, but it was the cliff itself that made her stop and stare. Rising from the eastern shore of the lake was a limestone formation, weathered and gray, its face scarred with shadows. And built into that cliff, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, was the cave house. Decades ago, someone had found a natural cave in the limestone and built a structure within it. The front of the house was timber, hand-hewn logs carefully joined, with real glass windows that caught the afternoon light. A roof extended out from the cave's mouth, covered in old cedar shingles, some missing, others green with moss. A stone chimney rose from the roof, clearly built with rock gathered from the site itself. The entire structure looked as though it had grown from the cliff face, as if the mountain itself had decided to offer shelter, and someone had simply accepted the gift. It was beautiful in a stark, solitary way, the kind of place that felt outside of time, forgotten by the modern world. Mira approached slowly, her ranger's instincts assessing the structure. The logs were old but solid, darkened by time but not rotted. The windows were intact, which surprised her. The small porch that extended from the front door was solid under her weight. Someone had built this to last, and built it well. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open on groaning hinges and stepped inside. The interior was a single large room, perhaps 20 feet by 20. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, built right into the limestone. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat near the windows. A raised sleeping platform had been built against the back wall, where the cave stretched deeper into the mountain. Shelves, mostly empty, lined the walls. The floor was wide wooden planks, dusty but intact. Light streamed through the windows in long shafts, illuminating dust motes in the air. The place smelled of old wood and stone, and the distinct must of a space that had been closed up for years. But it wasn't unpleasant. It was just quiet. She set down her pack and walked the perimeter, taking it all in with a ranger's eye. The fireplace showed signs of use, old ashes in the hearth. The sleeping platform held the remnants of an old mattress, long since deteriorated. The shelves held a few forgotten items: a rusted tin cup, an old kerosene lantern, an empty wooden box. At the back of the room, where the cave continued into darkness, someone had built a partition wall of wood, turning the rear portion into a storage area or a separate space. She'd need a light to explore back there properly. But standing in that main room, looking out the windows at the lake beyond, Mira felt something she hadn't felt in the Missoula apartment. She felt like she was home. This was a place where silence had meaning again, where solitude was a choice, not a condition. The mountains felt close enough to touch, and the lake reflected the sky like a promise. She didn't know why her father's initials were on that ad, or who had circled them, or what any of it meant. But standing there in the cave house, she knew she had made the right choice. Whatever this was, wherever it led, it was better than sitting in an apartment, waiting for nothing. That first night, she built a fire in the stone hearth, and was surprised when it drew perfectly. Whoever had built the chimney knew what they were doing. She unrolled her sleeping bag on the platform, boiled water for tea, and sat near the fire as darkness fell outside. The sounds were different here than in the high country where she worked. The lake lapped gently against the shore. The wind sighed through the pines, a softer sound than at higher elevations. And from the depths of the cave, beyond the partition wall, came the occasional sound of rock settling with the changing temperature, or the whisper of air moving through unseen passages. She sat there for hours, watching the fire burn, thinking about her father, wondering if he had ever been to this place, wondering what it would mean if he had. The dreams had been so persistent lately, his face so clear in them, as if he were trying to tell her something across the gulf of 60 years and death. The next day, she would explore the site properly, bring up the rest of her supplies, and truly settle in. But that night, she simply sat, absorbing the strangeness of it all. At 61 years old, alone on a mountain, in a cave house she'd bought for $50 because of two initials in a decades-old advertisement. In a way, her entire life had led her to this moment. She just didn't know why yet. For the first 3 days, Mira worked to make the cave house habitable. She hauled supplies up from her truck: groceries, propane for a camp stove, a water filtration system, and the batteries and solar panels she'd used when she was a park ranger. The lake water was clean enough to drink once filtered, and she set up a simple gravity-fed system that filled a barrel near the house. She swept away decades of dust, scrubbed the windows until they were clear, and repaired a rotten section of the porch railing. The work was familiar and satisfying. Physical labor had always helped her think, and there was something meditative about restoring order to a neglected space. But the partition wall at the back of the room nagged at her. It was clearly newer than the rest of the structure. The wood was less weathered, the construction less careful. Someone had built it as an afterthought, closing off the deeper part of the cave. She had tried the door on the first day, only to find it swollen and sealed shut by damp and time. On the fourth morning, she decided to deal with it properly. She took a pry bar from her tools and worked it into the door frame, careful not to damage anything she couldn't repair. The wood was stubborn, but after 20 minutes of patient effort, the door gave way with a groan of protest. The scent that billowed out was cool and mineral-rich, the scent of deep stone, untouched by sunlight. She switched on her headlamp and stepped inside. The cave continued for another 30 feet before narrowing into a passage too small to easily traverse. But this part was clearly natural. The walls were limestone, worn smooth by ancient water, and the floor was uneven bedrock. Someone had used this space for storage. Old wooden crates were stacked against one wall, most of them empty or containing the rotted remains of fabric and paper. A few mining tools leaned in a corner: a pickaxe, a shovel, and a hand drill. It was the floor that made her pause. In the main room, someone had laid wooden planks over the natural stone. Back here, there were planks as well, but they were rougher, less carefully fitted. and in the far corner, near where the cave narrowed, a section of the board sat slightly higher than the rest. She knelt beside it, running her hands over the edges. The boards here were loose, not nailed down. She worked her fingers under the edge and lifted. The cavity beneath was perhaps 2 feet deep, either carved out of the bedrock or a natural depression someone had taken advantage of. Inside, wrapped in an oilcloth that had preserved it from the damp, was a compass. Mira's hands trembled as she unwrapped it. The brass was tarnished but intact. The glass was uncracked. And on the back, etched in a script she would recognize anywhere, were the initials VD and a date, June 1964. Her father's compass. The one he carried on every survey job. The one he'd taught her to use when she was a little girl, sitting on the porch of their old house as he showed her how to sight a bearing and read the declination. The one that should have been with him when he walked into the wilderness and never came back. She sat there on the stone floor, holding the compass in both hands, and felt the world tilt on its axis. It wasn't possible. Her father had disappeared in June of 1964, and the search parties had found no trace of him. His truck was at a trailhead 80 kilometers from here. His camping gear was gone, but there was no body, no evidence, nothing. It had always been assumed he'd perished somewhere in the backcountry, that the wilderness had claimed him, as it sometimes did. But this compass, his compass, was here, in this cave hidden under the floorboards, which meant he had been here, in this exact place. And not just passing through. He had deliberately hidden something, taken the time to wrap it carefully and conceal it. She lifted the oilcloth out completely and found more beneath. Papers, yellowed but legible, covered in her father's handwriting. She would know that script anywhere. That careful, engineer's script he used for all his notes, survey calculations, mineral assay results, geological observations. And at the very bottom, something that made her catch her breath. Carved into the stone wall of the cavity, almost invisible unless you were looking right at it, were the initials VD and SK, her father's initials, and someone else's. SK. The letters were rough, clearly made with a knife or a sharp tool, but they were deliberate. Not vandalism, but a record. 2 people had been here together, and they had wanted to mark the fact. Mira spent the rest of the day going over the cave inch by inch. She examined every surface, peered behind every shelf, checked every corner, and she found more marks, subtle things you would miss if you weren't looking for them. Pencil notations on the underside of the table, measurements and calculations. A series of scratches on the stone near the fireplace that could have been a crude map. More initials carved into the wooden frame of the sleeping platform. All the evidence said the same thing. Her father had spent significant time in this place. He had worked here, hidden things here, and marked his presence here. All of it in June of 1964, the month he disappeared. She took out the property deed the real estate agent had sent and examined it more carefully than before. The land had changed hands several times over the decades, but the oldest notation was from 1963. Disputed mineral rights, and next to it, in faded ink, survey required. Bitter root mineral listed. Bitter root mineral. The company her father had worked for that last year. The company that had sent him on his final survey job. She spread everything out on the table as the afternoon light streamed through the windows. The compass, her father's notes, the property deed, the advertisement she had found with his initials circled, pieces of a puzzle she didn't yet understand, but that were somehow fitting together. Her father had been here, working on a mineral survey for a disputed property. He had hidden his compass, left marks and notes, carved his initials with someone whose name began with SK, and then he had vanished. And the property was abandoned. 60 years had passed, with the truth buried under the floorboards and forgotten. But not entirely forgotten. Someone had circled that ad with her father's initials. Someone wanted her to find this place. Someone who knew or suspected what had happened here. As dusk fell, Mira built another fire and sat with her father's compass in her hands, turning it over and over. The needle still worked, still pointed to true north when she held it level. He had taken good care of this compass, kept it clean and functional. He had relied on it for his work. And then he had hidden it here, instead of taking it with him. Why would he do that? Unless he knew he wouldn't be needing it anymore. Unless he knew he wasn't coming back. She thought of the last time she saw him, a memory she had replayed thousands of times over the years. He was packing for a trip, loading his truck with the gear he always took: tent, camp stove, survey equipment, maps. She had asked if she could go, as she sometimes did, and he had knelt down to her level, put his big hands on her shoulders, and said, "Not this time, little bear, but I'll bring you back something special." He called her Little Bear because she liked to climb trees and dig in the dirt. The name made her feel brave and wild. She had hugged him goodbye and watched him drive away, never knowing it would be the last time. That night in the cave house, holding his compass, she finally let herself ask the question she had avoided her whole life. What if her father's disappearance wasn't an accident? What if something else had happened? Something that required hiding evidence. Something that required marking a secret place. Something that ended with him gone and the truth buried? The fire burned low, and the sounds from the deeper cave seemed louder in the darkness. Not threatening exactly, but present. A reminder that the mountain held more than she could see, that caves ran deeper than the accessible rooms, that secrets could lie buried for generations. Tomorrow, she would go to town, find the county records office, and see what else she could find out about this property and the mineral survey of 1964. But tonight, she sat with the compass and let the weight of possibility settle over her. Her father had been here. He had left a trail for someone to find, maybe for her to find. And after 60 years of not knowing, she finally had a thread to follow. The compass needle pointed north, steady and true as it had ever been. Whatever else had changed, whatever truths were still buried, some things remained constant. She had spent her life in the mountains, learning to navigate by landmarks and instinct. Now she would use those same skills to navigate back in time, to find out what had happened to the man who taught her how to find her way home. The next morning, Mira prepared for a deeper exploration of the cave system. Her ranger training had included basic speleology, enough to know that caves could be dangerous, and you never went into one unprepared. She gathered her climbing rope, extra batteries for her headlamp, chalk to mark her path, and her old rescue whistle. If something went wrong, no one knew she was here. But at least she would be following proper safety protocols. The partition wall had hidden more than just a storage space. At the far back, where she had found her father's compass, the cave narrowed to a passage about a meter wide. She had noticed it the day before, but hadn't explored further. Now, with proper light and equipment, she squeezed through. The passage opened almost immediately into a larger chamber, this one clearly natural and untouched by human modification. The beam of her headlamp swept across limestone formations, small stalactites hanging from the ceiling, flowstone on the walls that caught the light and glimmered faintly. The air was cool and still, with that particular quality of cave air, as if it had been the same air for 1,000 years. But what caught her attention was the evidence that someone had used this space as a work area. In one corner stood a folding camp table, its metal legs rusted but still standing. On its surface, weighted down with rocks, were papers protected in a waterproof box. Leaning against the wall, she found tools, geological hammers, sample bags, a portable scale for weighing ore samples. This had been her father's field station. She was sure of it. The setup was exactly the kind of thing he would have created, efficient and organized, using the natural shelter to protect his work from the elements. She had seen photographs of his other survey sites, and they all had this same practical quality. She opened the waterproof box carefully, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her father's meticulous script. Survey notes, dated from May to early June 1964. Geological observations about the limestone formations, the mineral content of various rock samples, detailed measurements and calculations. But as she read through the entries, she realized something else. This wasn't just a standard survey. Her father was tracking something specific. He called it the vein in his notes, a mineral deposit that ran through the limestone in a particular formation, accessible from these caves, but extending deeper into the mountain. The first entries were excited, professional. Sample 14A shows promising concentrations of rare earth elements, particularly cerium and lanthanum. The vein appears to follow the limestone bed at an angle of roughly 15 degrees, suggesting an extensive deposit. He had documented his findings with the rigor of a man who understood their importance. But as the dates ticked forward into June, the tone of the entries shifted. They grew more cautious, more troubled. Additional tests reveal radon concentrations above safety limits. Extraction would require extensive, possibly cost-prohibitive, ventilation systems. And then, a few entries later, he reported the findings to the company, recommending extreme caution. The response was disheartening. There was pressure, he wrote, to minimize the risk assessment. Mira sat on the cave floor, reading by the beam of her headlamp, and felt the story taking shape around her. Her father had found something valuable, but also dangerous. He had honestly reported both the potential and the peril, and someone didn't want to hear about the peril. The last entries in the journal were dated June 14, 1964. Her father's handwriting was still meticulous, but the content was fraught with worry. They know I'm close to finalizing the assessment. SK warned me. Company representatives have been asking questions. Not about the survey, but about my personal reliability, whether I can be trusted to see the bigger picture. I don't like the implications. SK again, the same initials carved into the cave wall. Someone who worked with her father, someone who cared enough to warn him. And then, almost as an afterthought at the bottom of the page, if something happens, the complete documentation is in 3 locations. This site, the company's office archives, and with JT in Missoula. The truth must be preserved. The entry ended there. There were no more pages in the journal. June 14, 1964 had been his last written record. Mira flipped through the remaining pages, finding them blank, save for notes scrawled in the margins in a different ink, clearly added later by another hand. The script was angular and harsh where her father's was fluid. Short, clipped phrases. He's getting too close. This can't continue. Handle it. Someone had read her father's journal after he'd written in it, had added their own commentary, as if tracking his progress, monitoring his work. The realization sent a chill down her spine. Her father had been watched, his private notes violated. His concerns were being dismissed as he moved closer to completing his assessment. She photographed every page of the journal with her phone, careful to capture both her father's entries and the marginalia. Whatever had happened here, she needed documentation, proof that couldn't be lost or hidden again. Exploring the rest of the chamber, she found more of her father's equipment, sample bags labeled with dates and locations, most of them now empty. Whatever samples they held had long since been removed or had deteriorated. A clipboard with water-damaged, nearly illegible forms was wedged in a limestone crevice, beside another small item wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the cloth was a photograph, a faded color print from the early 1960s, the kind with slightly washed-out tones that made everything seem dreamlike. The photo showed 4 men standing at what she recognized as the entrance to this very cave house. They were posed like hunters with a prize, triumphant and confident. Her father stood on the left, younger than she remembered him, maybe 35, dressed in work clothes and a weary smile. Next to him was a man of similar age in overalls, burly and bearded. This must be Esco. The other 2 men were dressed differently. One wore work clothes but seemed more like a manager, a clipboard in his hand. The other wore a suit jacket, incongruous in the middle of the wilderness, his expression more severe than the others, less celebratory. Someone had taken a sharp instrument, likely a knife, and deliberately scratched out the face of the man in the suit. The deep gouges in the photograph made his features impossible to distinguish, but the rest of the image was intact. And on the back, written in her father's hand, May 1964. The discovery. V.D. S.K. Jr. and the boss. V.D. her father. S.K. the man in overalls. Jr. the one with the clipboard. And the boss, the man whose face had been destroyed. Someone didn't want him identified. They had physically removed him from the record, leaving everyone else visible. Mira studied the photo for a long time. 4 men who had made a significant find, who had stood together at the mouth of this cave, filled with hope or greed or ambition, or whatever it is that drives people to seek wealth in the earth. And within a few short weeks, her father was gone. The property would be abandoned, and 60 years would pass before anyone looked at this photo again. She continued to explore, finding more evidence of excavation and survey work. Someone had dug test pits in the cave floor, collected core samples, mapped the walls, all of it systematic and professional. Her father had been meticulous in his work, and whoever SK was had been his partner in it. But the marginal notes in the journal kept echoing in her mind. Handle it. A phrase so cold, so clinical and bureaucratic, as if her father were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. As if getting rid of him had been a management decision, filed away on someone's agenda between lunch meetings and conference calls. When she finally returned to the main room of the cave house, the sunlight pouring through the windows was startling after the darkness below. She stood there for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, thinking about everything she had found. Her father's journal outlining both a valuable discovery and its inherent dangers, his concern about being trusted, the final note about preserving the documentation, and the photograph with the scratched-out face. This was not the story of a man who got lost in the wilderness. It was the story of a man who knew he was in danger and tried to leave a trail for someone to follow, someone who would eventually come looking for the truth. She laid everything out on the table, the compass, the journal, the photograph, and looked at it all together. Pieces of a mystery that was beginning to take shape. Her father had found something valuable in this cave system. He had reported the risks honestly, had been watched and pressured, and then he had vanished. All of it had been buried, but not destroyed. Hidden away, waiting, as if he knew that someday someone would come looking. Hoping, perhaps, that it would be her. The drive to Thornhill took longer than Mira had expected. The mountain roads were in worse shape than she remembered, washed out in places from the spring thaw, poorly maintained. The town appeared around a bend in the road, like something from another era. A single main street lined with brick buildings from a long-gone mining boom. Half of them were now vacant, their windows boarded up or broken. This had once been a thriving place when Montana's mineral wealth drew people from all over the country. Now, it seemed most of those people had left, taking the prosperity with them. The few businesses that remained, a diner, a hardware store, a gas station, had the tired look of enterprises running more on momentum and stubbornness than profit. The county clerk's office was in the old municipal building, a low brick structure with limestone trim. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and floor wax. A single clerk sat behind a wooden counter that likely dated to the 1940s, reading a paperback with a cracked spine. He looked up as Mira entered, his expression shifting from mild annoyance at the interruption to something more interested. He was old, probably in his late 70s, with thick glasses and hands that showed the tremor of age, but his eyes were sharp, and when he spoke, his voice was clear. "Can I help you find something?" "I'm looking for records on a property in the Bitterroot Range," Mira said, "and information on a mining company that was operating here in the 1960s, Bitterroot Mineral Limited." The man's expression shifted. Not much, but enough for her to notice a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or a memory stirring. "That's a long time ago," he said. "Virgil, by the way. I've run this office for 43 years. He set his book down and moved closer to the counter. "What's your interest in Bitterroot Mineral?" "It's personal," Mira said. "My father worked for them. He disappeared in 1964 while surveying a property. I'm trying to understand what happened." Virgil watched her for a long moment. "What was your father's name?" "Vincent Delaney." Something changed in Virgil's face. Sadness, maybe, or an old pain rising to the surface. "I remember when he went missing," he said softly. "The whole town was talking about it. Your father was a good man, fair, honest. People trusted him." He paused. "You have his eyes." Mira felt her throat tighten. "Thank you. I don't have many memories. I was young when it happened." Virgil nodded. "What are you looking for specifically?" "Anything on the property he was surveying. Mineral rights, ownership disputes, company records, anything that can tell me what he was working on." Virgil was quiet for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "Let me get the archives. It'll take a few minutes. Everything from that era is in the basement files." He disappeared through a door behind the counter, and Mira heard his footsteps creaking down a set of stairs. She waited, looking around the office. Topographical maps on the walls, yellowed and curled at the edges. Filing cabinets that looked like they had been there since the Eisenhower administration. A calendar from a local insurance company showing a mountain lake, not unlike the one by her cave house. When Virgil returned, He was carrying two dusty archive boxes. He set them on the counter with a grunt. Here's what we have on Bitterroot Mineral Limited and the disputed property from that period. You can have a look at that table over there. He gestured to a wooden table by the window. Make copies if you need to. Machines over there. 10 cents a page. Mira carried the boxes to the table and began to sort through the contents. The documents were exactly what she had hoped to find. A paper trail of the events surrounding her father's last survey. The earliest documents were from 1963. A prospector named Silas Karn had filed a mineral claim on a property in the Bitterroot Range, asserting he had discovered a significant deposit of rare earth elements. The claim was almost immediately challenged by Bitterroot Mineral Limited, which held adjacent properties and argued Karn's claim overlapped with their existing rights. The legal filings showed a back and forth between lawyers, technical arguments about survey boundaries and mineral bed formations. The language was dense and bureaucratic, but the basic story was clear. Karn claimed he'd found something valuable, and the company wanted it. In May of 1964, an agreement was reached to hire an independent surveyor to assess the boundaries and the mineral content. That surveyor was Vincent Delaney. Mira found the contract, with her father's signature on it. His commitment to provide an impartial technical assessment within 6 weeks. She found his preliminary report, dated May 28, 1964. It was technical but clear. Karn's claim was valid. The mineral deposit was present and significant, containing commercially viable concentrations of rare earth elements. But, as her father had underlined in this section, the deposit also featured dangerous levels of radon gas in the rock matrix. Extraction would require extensive safety measures and specialized ventilation systems. The cost would be, in his estimation, prohibitively expensive with current mining technology. So the minerals were there, but getting them out safely would cost more than they were worth, at least in 1964. The next document was the one that made Mira's hands tremble. Dated June 17, 1964, 3 days after her father's last journal entry. It was a transfer of mineral rights. Silas Karn had signed over his entire claim to Bitterroot Mineral Limited for a seemingly token sum. The signature was shaky. The notary's stamp was faint, as if the whole thing had been done in a hurry. Then, a week later, the property was deemed unsuitable for mining operations and officially abandoned. All rights were relinquished, and the site was removed from active consideration. She leafed through more documents and found a death certificate that took her breath away. Silas Karn died June 25, 1964. Cause of death: hunting accident. He was found in the forest 5 miles from the disputed property, an apparent victim of an accidental discharge from his own rifle. 2 men connected to this property, her father and Karn, both gone within 2 weeks of each other. One vanished without a trace, the other dead in an accident. And in the time between their deaths, the mineral rights were transferred, and the property was buried in the archives. Find what you were looking for? Virgil had come to stand beside her table, making her jump slightly. More than I wanted to, Mira said. She showed him the documents, the mineral rights transfer, and Karn's death certificate. This doesn't feel like a coincidence. Virgil's expression was grim. It never did. There were rumors back then, of course, but no one could ever prove a thing. The company had lawyers, money, connections. Karn was just a prospector. And your father was, well. He trailed off. Mira finished for him. Even if they never found a body. I'm sorry, Virgil said, his voice softening. I liked your father. He came into this office several times during his survey. Always polite, always professional. The last time I saw him was early June. He seemed troubled, but when I asked if everything was all right, he just said the work was getting complicated. Do you remember anything else? Anything he might have said or done that seemed unusual? Virgil thought for a moment. He asked about the property's history. Who owned it before Karn? How long it had been staked? He seemed particularly interested in the cave formations. Asked if there were any old mining records about natural tunnels or passages in that area. Were there? Mira asked. A few mentions from back in the 1890s when the first prospectors came through. Nothing detailed. But your father seemed to think the caves might run deeper than anyone had ever mapped. Virgil paused. Then he asked about something else. The company's ownership structure. Who was really calling the shots? What did you tell him? Mira asked. That bitterroot mineral was majority owned by a silent partner named T. Ashford. Never came to town, never showed his face, but he controlled all the major decisions through proxy votes and a few local executives. T. Ashford. The boss from her father's photograph. The one whose face had been scratched out. Is there anything in these files about Ashford? Mira pressed. Not much. The articles of incorporation list him as the primary investor. That's about it. Virgil went back to the counter and returned with a single sheet of paper. This is from the original company charter, 1959. Mira scanned it. T. Ashford, address listed as Helena, Montana. No first name, just the initial. A capital investment of $500,000, a staggering sum in 1959, and a note that Ashford maintained final approval on all major operational decisions. Do you know if anyone else has asked about these records recently? Mira asked. Virgil's expression shifted, a wary look clouding his eyes. Funny you should ask. A man came in about 3 weeks ago. 50s, well-dressed, drove an expensive SUV. He asked specifically about the Delaney survey and the Karn property, paid cash for copies and didn't give a name. 3 weeks ago, right around the time Mira would have found that classified ad in her old Ranger files. What was he like? Tall, fit, expensive haircut. He had that air people get when they're used to being the most important person in the room. Polite enough, but you could tell he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. He claimed he was researching historical mining operations for a book, but he wasn't taking notes like a writer. He was looking for specific information, and he knew exactly which documents he wanted. Mira had him make copies of everything. The transfer of mineral rights, her father's survey report, Karn's death certificate, the articles of incorporation. The pile of paper grew, and with it, the shape of what happened became clearer. Her father had found something valuable, but it was too dangerous to be mined profitably. He had reported that honestly, and someone, likely this T. Ashford, had decided the solution was to eliminate the witnesses and secure the rights anyway. Even if the minerals couldn't be extracted then, they would still hold value for later, if technology improved or prices went up. 2 men dead, the rights stolen, the truth buried, and now, 60 years later, someone was interested in the property again. The mystery man who had come to this office, who knew exactly what to look for. Thank you, Mira said to Virgil, gathering her copies. This helps more than you know. Be careful, Virgil said, his voice low. Whatever happened back then, it involved people who were willing to kill to protect their interests. If someone's digging into it again, after all these years, there's a reason, and it's probably not a good one. Mira drove back toward the mountains with the documents on the passenger seat beside her. The sun was setting, painting the peaks in gold and rose, It was a beautiful place, the kind that felt peaceful and timeless, as if nothing bad could ever happen here. But she knew better. The mountains kept secrets, and some of them were written in blood. Mira made it back to the cave house as full darkness settled over the mountains. She'd left a single lantern burning in the window, and seeing its small point of light through the trees gave her an unexpected sense of homecoming. 3 weeks in this place, and it already felt more like home than her apartment in Missoula ever had. But tonight, something felt different. She couldn't put her finger on it, just a nagging sense that the space had been disturbed in her absence. Nothing obvious. The door was still locked, the windows intact. It was just a gut feeling, honed by 30 years as a park ranger, an ability to sense when an environment had been altered. She approached cautiously, circling the property before going inside. The beam of her flashlight swept across the porch, the windows, the tree line behind. No fresh footprints in the soft dirt near the entrance. No sign of a forced entry. But the feeling persisted. Inside, everything looked just as she had left it. Her sleeping bag on the platform, her few belongings arranged on the shelves, the fire, long since turned to ash in the hearth. She set down her pack and the documents from Thornhill, then checked the back chamber of the cave. The journal was still where she'd hidden it. Her father's compass, safe in her coat pocket. But tucked just under the edge of her sleeping bag, barely visible, was a small slip of paper. She pulled it out carefully and unfolded it. The message was brief, printed in block capitals with a cheap ballpoint pen. Get out while you still can. Her first reaction wasn't fear, but a surge of cold anger. Someone had been in her home, had violated this space, had thought a simple threat would be enough to scare her away. She'd dealt with worse in her ranger days. Aggressive hikers, territorial hunters, people on the run from something who didn't like being found. She examined the note more closely. The paper was common, the kind you'd buy at any gas station. The pen strokes were deliberate, pressed hard enough to score the paper. Whoever wrote this meant to be taken seriously, but they didn't want to be identified. Mira sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, her mind racing. The mystery man at the county office had been there 3 weeks ago, before she had even arrived. This note was recent, likely left today while she was in Thornhill, which meant someone was watching her, tracking her movements. Someone who wanted this property clear and was willing to use intimidation to make it happen. But why? The property had been abandoned for 60 years. The minerals her father had documented were valuable, but dangerous to extract. Unless the technology had changed. Unless what was impossible in 1964 was now feasible. She pulled out her phone, grateful for the weak signal she could get by standing near the south window. A quick search for rare earth mineral prices confirmed her suspicion. Values had skyrocketed in the last few decades. Elements that were scientific curiosities in 1964 were now essential components in modern electronics, renewable energy systems, and advanced manufacturing. What might have been worth thousands then could be worth millions now, and extraction technology had advanced too. Modern mining operations used sophisticated ventilation systems, radon mitigation techniques, and remotely operated equipment. What her father had deemed prohibitively dangerous 6 decades ago was now standard practice. Someone knew the minerals were still here. They knew extracting them was now profitable, and they wanted clear access to the property, without complications like an owner who might ask questions or demand a fair price. Mira built a fire and heated water for tea. Then she sat at the table with all her evidence spread out before her. The compass, the journal, the photograph, the documents from Thornhill, and now, the threatening note. She arranged it chronologically, trying to see the whole picture. May 1964, her father and Silas Carn discover valuable minerals. June 1964. Her father honestly reports the extraction risks. Someone, likely T. Ashford, decides to eliminate the complications. Her father disappears around June 15th. On June 17th, Carn signs over his rights under duress. On June 25th, Carn dies in a hunting accident. By July, the property is abandoned and forgotten. 60 years pass. Technology improves. Mineral prices soar. Someone realizes the old property is now a viable prospect. They research its history and discover the Vincent Delaney connection. They place a classified ad with his initials, knowing that if his daughter is still out there, she might respond. She did. She bought the property for $50, and now they were trying to scare her off so they could move in. But something didn't add up. If they wanted the property, why make it available to her in the first place? Why not just acquire it themselves through the usual channels? She went back to the property deed and read it more carefully. The chain of ownership was convoluted, passing through various holding companies over the decades. The current owner of record, the one who sold it to her, was listed as Mountain Heritage Properties, LLC, a shell corporation, likely created to hide the true owners. But the deed also showed something else. There was a note about disputed mineral rights, unresolved since 1964. Carn's forced transfer had never been fully validated because his death had cut the legal process short. The property's surface rights and mineral rights were technically separate, and both were mired in legal ambiguity, which meant that whoever wanted to mine here couldn't just buy the land. They needed a clear title to both the surface and the minerals. That would require either a lengthy court battle or the cooperation of the surface owner. Her cooperation. That's why they'd made the property available. They needed a proxy, someone to take ownership. Someone who would either sell cheap when approached, or who could be removed if they proved stubborn. A $50 property wasn't valuable enough to fight for, they assumed. An old woman living alone in the mountains would be easy to intimidate or buy out. They had miscalculated. The sounds from deep within the cave began again, pulling her from her thoughts. A rhythmic, purposeful sound, like machinery running or tools striking rock. She had noticed it before, but had dismissed it as the natural sounds of the cave. Water dripping, rock settling, air moving through unseen passages. But now, listening with new intent, she realized it was too regular, too consistent for anything but human activity. She grabbed her headlamp and a length of rope and went into the back chamber. The sounds were louder here, echoing from the narrow passage at the far end. She squeezed through, moving carefully, following the sound deeper into the cave system than she had ever gone before. The passage twisted and descended, opening into chambers she hadn't yet explored. And in one of those chambers, she found something that stopped her cold. Fresh excavations. New tool marks scarred the walls. Rock dust that hadn't yet settled coated the floor. And modern equipment. A portable core drill, battery-powered work lights, plastic boxes for holding samples. Someone had been mining in here. Recently. Likely within the last week. She scanned the site more carefully. This was professional gear, neatly staged. Core samples had been taken from the walls, labeled and organized. Fans were set up to manage the air quality. This wasn't some amateur prospector. This was a systematic, well-funded, and illegal operation. This was her property now, and no one had permission to be here, let alone conduct a mining survey. She took photos with her phone, documenting everything. Then she pushed on, following the signs of excavation. The cave system was more extensive than she had imagined, with multiple chambers branching off the main passage. In the deepest chamber she could reach, she found it. The main lode her father had documented, a visible seam of darker rock running through the limestone, the source of the rare minerals. Modern equipment surrounded it, a more sophisticated drill rig, sample analysis kits, mapping tools, and on a folding table set against one wall, she found paperwork, survey maps, assay results, and cost of extraction projections. Everything was marked with a company logo, Ashford Development Corporation. Ashford. The same name from the 1964 company records. The family that had killed her father was still involved, still trying to profit from the theft they'd set in motion 60 years ago. She was looking through the documents when she heard voices echoing from somewhere back in the cave system. Distant, but getting closer. People were coming, probably workers, coming to check on their operation. Mira quickly gathered what evidence she could carry. A few documents, photographs of everything else, and retreated the way she had come. She reached the narrow passage and squeezed through. Just as she heard footsteps entering the chamber behind her, she was back in the main room of the cave house. Heart pounding, she locked the door to the back chamber and considered her options. She had proof now, proof of illegal mining, proof of the company's involvement, proof that it all connected to her father's death. But she needed more. She needed to know who, specifically, was behind this, and she had to stop them before they could cover their tracks, just like they did back in 1964. The note under her sleeping bag had been a warning, but it told her something important. They didn't know she'd discovered their operation yet. They thought she was just some old woman who'd stumbled onto a property with a mysterious history. They thought intimidation would be enough. She would make them regret that assumption. The sound of a vehicle's engine woke Mira before dawn. She had been sleeping lightly, half expecting something like this. Through the window, she saw headlights approaching through the trees. Bright, expensive LEDs, the kind that came on luxury SUVs. She dressed quickly and went to meet whoever it was on the porch, preferring to control the encounter rather than be cornered inside. The sky to the east was just beginning to lighten, stars still visible overhead. Her breath fogged in the cold mountain air. The SUV stopped 20 yards from the cabin. A man got out, dressed far too elegantly for the wilderness in pressed khakis and a fleece jacket that probably cost more than Mira's entire wardrobe. He was about 55, fit in a way that suggested gyms and personal trainers, and he had the kind of confident posture that comes from a lifetime of getting what you want. "Ms. Delaney," he said, approaching with his hand outstretched. "Roland Ashford. I believe we have things to discuss, Ashford." The name confirmed what she suspected. She didn't take his hand, just stood on the porch, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. Let him work for this conversation. Roland lowered his hand, his smile faltering slightly. "My apologies for the hour, but I wanted to catch you before you started your day. May I come in? It's rather cold out here." "We can talk on the porch," Mira said. "I don't know you, and I'm not in the habit of letting strangers into my home." "Fair enough." Roland leaned against the porch railing, his posture casual but calculated. "I'll get right to it. I've been researching my family's business history. My grandfather was a silent partner in several mining ventures in this area back in the 1960s. I recently uncovered some troubling events that took place, including the disappearance of your father. I wanted to reach out personally to express my condolences and see if we can find a way to make things right. It was smooth. Mira had to give him that. The tone of a concerned grandson looking to right historical wrongs. But his eyes were sharp, calculating, watching her reactions carefully. "How did you find me?" she asked. "Property records. When I was looking into the old Karna claim, I noticed it had recently changed hands. The name Delaney caught my eye, and I made a few inquiries. Found out you were Vincent Delaney's daughter. It seemed too significant to be a coincidence." "And what exactly do you think needs to be made right?" Roland shifted, choosing his words. "From what I've pieced together, my grandfather was the primary investor in Bitterroot Mineral Limited. The company president, a man named Gordon Hale, was apparently ruthless in his business practices. When your father's research showed there were valuable but difficult to extract minerals here, Hale decided to eliminate the complications. Your father and Silas Kern, and take the mineral rights by force. It was a good story. Blame a dead man. Position yourself as the reasonable family member seeking redemption." Mira waited, letting him continue. "My grandfather found out what Hale had done after the fact. He was horrified, but he couldn't prove anything. And by then, the damage was done. The property was abandoned because the extraction wasn't feasible with 1960s technology, and everyone involved tried to forget the whole ugly business. My grandfather carried that guilt for the rest of his life." "It's a nice story," Mira said. "Convenient, since it blames someone who can't defend himself." Roland's expression tightened. "I have documentation that supports this version of events. But regardless of the details, the fact remains that your father died in connection with my family's business interests. I would like to compensate you for that loss. I'm prepared to offer you $250,000 for this property, as a gesture of restorative justice. It's more than fair market value, and it would allow you to—" "Did you leave the note?" Mira cut in. "What note?" "The one under my sleeping bag yesterday. Get out while you still can." Roland's surprise looked genuine. "I most certainly did not. If someone has threatened you, that is unacceptable. Have you reported it to the authorities?" "Not yet. But I did find something interesting yesterday. There's an illegal mining operation in the caves below this property. Professional equipment, systematic extraction, all without the owner's permission. That would be me." Roland's mask dropped for a moment, fury flashing across his face before he controlled it. "I don't know anything about that." "Really? Because the equipment is branded with your company's logo, Ashford Development Corporation." The silence stretched between them. Mira could see him recalculating, trying to decide how to play this. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted. It was harder, more direct. "Let's be frank, Ms. Delaney. We both know what's down there. Rare earth minerals worth millions. My family laid claim to those minerals 60 years ago, and we are prepared to exercise that claim now. The legal situation is complicated. But I have the resources to tie you up in court for years if I have to. I would much rather settle this amicably. You take the money, move somewhere comfortable, and let me develop this site properly. Everyone wins." "Your grandfather murdered my father." "You can't prove that." "Maybe not yet. But I have my father's research journal. I have photographs. I have county records showing suspicious transfers and convenient deaths. And now I have evidence of illegal mining on my property. That's enough to start asking some very uncomfortable questions. Roland pushed himself off the railing, his friendly demeanor gone completely. You don't want to make an enemy of me. I have lawyers, resources, connections. I can make your life very difficult if you insist on being stubborn about this. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact. This is business, Ms. Delaney. Your father understood that, even if it cost him. Sometimes principles are expensive. Mira stepped down from the porch, deliberately moving closer to Roland. She'd dealt with men like him before, bullies who mistook politeness for weakness. Get off my property. Get your equipment out of my caves. And if I find anyone here again without my permission, I'm calling the sheriff and the FBI. The FBI? Roland laughed. For what? Interstate fraud, illegal mining, theft of mineral rights, possibly a 60-year-old conspiracy to commit murder? I'm sure they'll find something interesting once they start digging into your family's business. Roland's jaw clenched. You're making a mistake. I've been making mistakes my whole life. I'm comfortable with it. Mira held his gaze until he looked away first. You have 48 hours to remove your equipment. After that, I document everything and hand it over to the federal authorities. Roland walked back to his SUV, but paused with his hand on the door. My offer still stands. $4 million. That's more money than you've likely seen in your entire life. Think about what you're giving up for the sake of pride. I'm not giving up anything. I'm taking back what your family stole. He left without another word, tires spinning slightly on the soft ground, kicking up dust and pine needles. Mira watched until his taillights disappeared into the trees. Then she went back inside. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding her system. She had effectively declared war on a man with resources, connections, and a family history of making problems disappear. But backing down had never been in her nature. Her father hadn't backed down, even when he knew what it might cost him. She could do no less. She made coffee and sat at her table, mapping out her next steps. She had evidence, but it was scattered. Personal documents, photographs, county clerk records. She needed professional help, people with the authority to investigate properly and protect her while they did it. The local FBI office in Missoula seemed like the right place to start. Federal crimes crossed state lines, and the Ashford family's business empire likely did too. If she could get an agent interested, they would have the resources to dig deep, to find connections she couldn't see on her own. But she also had to find the other proof her father had mentioned. The note in his journal had been clear. Documentation in 3 places. She had found the cache in the cave. The company office files would be long gone, likely destroyed when bitter root mineral went under. But the 3rd location, with JT in Missoula, that might still exist. JT. Jim Talbot. The name had finally come to her last night, lying in the dark. One of her father's old friends, someone he'd mentioned when she was a little girl. She had vague memories of him visiting the house a few times. A tall man who always brought peppermints and taught her card tricks. If he was still alive, he'd be very old. But it was worth a shot. If her father had trusted him with documentation, maybe he still had it. Maybe he was still waiting, after 60 years, for someone to come asking about Vincent Delaney. She packed a bag with copies of everything she'd found, secured the cave house as best she could, and prepared to make another trip to Missoula. But this time, she would be more careful. Roland knew she was asking questions, and his people knew their operation had been discovered. They would be watching her, looking for a way to silence her before she could cause any real trouble. Her father had faced the same thing. He knew he was in danger, documented everything he could, and tried to ensure the truth would survive, even if he didn't. Now, it was her turn to see if she could do better, to see if she could not only preserve the truth, but live to see it acknowledged. Mira knew she couldn't leave immediately, not after her confrontation with Roland. His workers would be clearing the equipment from the caves, and she needed to document everything before they could scrub the evidence. She waited until late morning, watching from the cover of the trees, before making her way back into the cave system. The workers were there, just as she'd expected. Two men in work clothes, systematically dismantling the drilling operation and packing the equipment into plastic crates. They were oblivious to her approach. She had spent 30 years moving silently through the wilderness, and those skills hadn't faded. She took photos from the shadows, documenting the equipment, the workers' faces, the extent of the excavation, proof that would corroborate the illegal mining if Roland tried to deny it all. She was about to retreat when one of the men's cell phones rang, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "Yeah, Roland, we're clearing out now. The old woman has already documented the whole operation, so there's no point trying to hide it." A pause. "What about her? You want us to take care of her?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Understood. We'll be gone by tonight." Mira waited until they moved into a different chamber, then slipped deeper into the cave system, following the passages she'd mapped in her earlier explorations. She needed to see everything before they removed it, to understand the full scope of what they'd been doing down here. The deepest accessible chamber was where they had focused their efforts. The mineral vein, the one her father had documented, was exposed there, and the workers had taken extensive core samples, mapping the formation and analyzing its content. But it was what she found tucked into a crevice at the back of the chamber that changed everything. A metal box similar to the one that had held her father's compass, but this one was marked with her name. For Mira Delaney was etched onto the metal surface. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable, even after 60 years. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, sealed in plastic to protect it from the damp, was a letter. She pulled it out carefully, unfolding the pages her father had written in the last days of his life. The letter was dated June 15th, 1964, the day after his last journal entry, the day he disappeared. "My dearest Mira," it began, and she had to stop, tears blurring her vision. His handwriting was so familiar, so painfully present. It was as if he were speaking to her directly across the chasm of 60 years. "If you are reading this, it means I didn't make it. I am so sorry for this. More than I can ever say. I wanted to watch you grow up, to see the woman you would become. I wanted to teach you about these mountains, to share everything I've learned with you. But sometimes, life demands we make choices that cost us everything we hold dear. I found something here. Minerals so valuable that men are willing to kill for them. I was hired to give an honest assessment of this property, and that is what I did. I reported what I found. Rare earth elements in significant quantities, but locked in rock formations that make extraction dangerous and expensive. With current technology, mining here would risk lives and cost more than the minerals are worth. But the man who controls Bitterroot Mineral doesn't want to hear about limitations. Ashford called me into his office 3 days ago and laid his position bare. I could revise my report to downplay the risks, or I could face the consequences. When I refused, he made threats against my job, my reputation, my family, against you and your mother. I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let corruption triumph just because the price of integrity was high. So, I documented everything. I made several copies of my survey, my findings, and the proof of Ashford's attempts to bribe me. I've hidden copies in 3 places where they will be safe, where the truth might eventually come to light. This cave is one of those places. I worked with Silas Kerna to create a record that can't be easily destroyed. Silas knows what we're up against. He's received threats, too. Demands that he sign over his mineral rights for nothing. We have both decided to stand our ground, even though we know what that stand may cost us. The second location is the company office archives, though I suspect Ashford will destroy them the moment I'm gone. The third is with my dear friend, Jim Talbert, in Missoula. Jim doesn't know what's in the envelope I gave him, only that it's important and that someone might come for it someday. I trust him to keep that promise. Mira, my little bear, I need you to understand why I am making this choice. It would be easy to fake the report, to take Ashford's money, to look the other way and keep my family safe. But that would make me complicit in any harm caused by careless mining here. It would make me part of the corruption instead of someone who stood against it. I want you to grow up knowing your father was an honest man. That when faced with a choice between safety and integrity, he chose integrity. Not because I am brave, I am terrified right now, but because some things are more important than survival. If you are reading this, you have found your way to this cave. It means you've probably uncovered at least part of what happened here. I hope you find the other documents, that you piece the story together, and that you know I died trying to do the right thing. I'm leaving something else in this box, a property deed. Silas and I have been working with a lawyer to transfer ownership of this land into a trust in your name. It won't be finalized until next week, but Silas has signed the preliminary paperwork establishing your claim. If something happens to us, this property should eventually be yours. Not for the minerals, but because this place is beautiful and peaceful, and because I spent my last days here thinking of you. I love you more than words can say. I am already so proud of you, even though you are only 11, and I will not get to see who you become. Be brave. Be honest. Be kind. Seek the truth, even when it's hard. And remember that every choice I made, even this last one, was to give you a world where integrity matters. Your loving father, Vincent Mia, sat in that cave chamber, her father's letter in her hands, and wept. These were not the silent tears she had shed before, but deep, racking sobs that came from a lifetime of pain finally finding release. He knew he was going to die. He had accepted it as the price of standing his ground, and he had left this for her. A message across time, the explanation she had needed her entire life. When she could breathe again, she examined the rest of the box's contents. There was indeed a property deed. Preliminary documents showing Silas Kerna's intent to transfer ownership to a trust established for Mira Delaney. The final signatures were missing. Kerna had died before the process could be completed, but the intention was clear. Her father was trying to give her this place. Not the minerals, but the land itself. The cave home, the lake, the mountains, a sanctuary, a home, a connection to him, even after death. She understood then why the classified ad used her father's initials. Jim Talbert, keeping his promise after 60 years, had finally located the property and arranged for it to become available to her. The $50 price tag was his way of ensuring she could afford it. His way of honoring Vincent Delaney's last wish. But she understood something else, too. something that changed the entire picture. Her father's letter made it clear that T. Ashford had ordered the murders. Not Gordon Hale, not some nameless company president, but Ashford himself. Roland's story about his grandfather discovering the crimes after the fact was a lie. His grandfather had been the architect of those crimes, and now the grandson was continuing the family business of theft and murder. Roland's smooth talk of restorative justice was manipulation. His offer to buy the property was an attempt to acquire what his grandfather had tried to steal 60 years ago. And his illegal mining operation was simply a modern version of the same crime. Taking what wasn't his, no matter the cost, to others. She was photographing the letter and the deed when she heard voices again. The workers, returning to this chamber. She quickly packed everything back into the box, locked it, and looked for an escape route. The chamber had a narrow passage leading deeper into the mountain, too small for mining equipment, but possibly navigable for a person. She slipped through, ignoring the tight squeeze and the rough stone, following the passage as it snaked through the limestone. Behind her, she heard the workers enter the chamber, discussing how to remove the last of the drilling equipment. The passage eventually opened into a space she had never seen, a natural cathedral in the stone. Stalactites hung from a ceiling 30 feet above. A small, subterranean stream trickled through the center. It was beautiful, ancient, and completely hidden from the world above. And there, carved into the wall near the stream, were two more sets of initials, larger and more carefully made than the others, VD and SK, her father and Silas Kerna. They had found this place together and marked their presence together. Two men facing death, wanting to leave some record of their defiant partnership. Mia stood in that hidden chamber, surrounded by stone and water and silence, and felt the weight of everything she had learned. Her father hadn't been the victim of some random wilderness tragedy. He had been murdered for refusing to bend, for choosing integrity over survival, and the family of his killer was still profiting from that crime, still using the same tactics of intimidation and theft. But her father had also left her a path forward. Evidence in 3 locations, a property that was rightfully hers, and most importantly, an example of courage she could now follow. She found her way back through the passages to the main cave system, careful to avoid the workers. By the time she reached her cabin, afternoon light was slanting through the windows, and she already had a plan. Tomorrow she would drive to Missoula, find Jim Talbert, and collect the final piece of evidence. Then she would take everything to the FBI and make sure the Ashford family finally paid for 60 years of crimes. Roland thought she was just an old woman, easy to intimidate or buy off. He was about to find out how wrong that assumption was. Her father had died standing up to corruption. She was still alive, still fighting, and she had no intention of backing down. The drive to Missoula the next morning was different from her previous trips to the city. Mia was no longer searching for answers. She was gathering ammunition. Everything she had found, everything she had learned, was leading to a confrontation that would finally bring the truth to light. She started at the public library with the city directory, searching for Jim Talbert. The name was listed: Talbert, J., Mountain View Retirement Community. Her heart leaped at the sight of it. After 60 years, her father's friend was still alive, still in Missoula, still potentially holding the promise he made in June of 1964. The retirement community was on the south side of town, a modern facility with manicured lawns and a view of the mountains. The receptionist at the front desk was cheerful and helpful, when Mia asked to see Jim Talbert. "He doesn't get many visitors," the woman said, checking her computer. "He'll be so pleased. He's in the assisted living wing, room 147. Just sign in here and I'll get you a visitor's badge." Mia followed the directions down carpeted hallways that smelled of cleaning products and institutional food. The door to room 147 was open, and inside, she found an elderly gentleman in a wheelchair by the window, gazing out at the mountains with the patient calm of someone who has learned to measure time differently. He turned as she knocked, and his eyes widened in recognition, though they had never met. "You look just like him," he said immediately. "Just like Vincent. I've been waiting for you." Mia stepped inside, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "You placed the classified ad. You're the one who made sure I found the property." Jim nodded slowly. "Took me years to track down that deed, to figure out how to get the property into your hands without raising suspicion. I had to be patient, had to wait for the right moment." He motioned to a chair beside him. "Sit. Tell me what you've found." She spent the next hour telling him everything. The compass under the floorboards, the journal with his notes in the margins, the county records showing Kerna's death, and the suspicious transfer of mineral rights, the confrontation with Roland Ashford, the illegal mining operation, and finally, the letter her father had left for her, deep inside the cave. Jim listened with tears tracking down his weathered face, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of acknowledgement. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, looking out the window at the mountains. "Vincent came to see me on June 14th, 1964, Jim said at last. "He showed up at my house in the evening, looking worried but determined. He gave me an envelope and made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd keep it safe. He said his daughter would need it one day, and that I should make sure she got it when the time was right. Do you still have it?" "Never let it out of my sight for 60 years. Jim wheeled himself to a small desk in the corner, unlocked a drawer with a key he wore on a cord around his neck, and pulled out a manila envelope, yellowed with age but sealed with wax that had never been broken. Mia's hands trembled as she took it. The seal bore her father's initials, pressed into the wax. She broke it carefully and slid out the contents. Inside was her father's complete, original survey report. All the findings, all the measurements, all the analysis, unaltered, professionally documented, signed, and notarized. A perfect record of what he had discovered and what he had recommended. The hazard ratings were there, clearly stated. The extraction cost estimates were documented. Everything an honest surveyor would include in a comprehensive assessment. But there was something else, too. A letter from T. Ashford to Vincent Delaney, dated June 10, 1964. The letter was typed on company letterhead and was as close to a confession as Mia could ever hope to find. "Mr. Delaney," it read, "your preliminary findings on the Kerna property have been noted, but they are not acceptable. The extraction difficulties you cite are overstated and will be managed through proper engineering. Your final report should reflect commercial viability without an undue focus on minor safety concerns. A revised assessment, focusing on the value of the deposit and minimizing risk factors, will be expected by June 20th. Your cooperation in this matter will be financially rewarded. Your refusal would be extremely unwise. Sincerely, T. Ashford." It was all there. The pressure to falsify, the implied threat, the expectation of compliance. Her father had kept that letter as proof, understanding that Ashford's own words would condemn him. There were also copies of the legal documents establishing the trust for Mia, showing Silas Kerna's intent to transfer the property to her, and a signed statement from Kerna himself, dated June 16th, detailing the threats he'd received and expressing his fear that he would not survive to complete the transfer. "Your father knew he was in danger," Jim said softly. "He told me as much, but he wouldn't back down. Said some things were worth dying for, and integrity was one of them. I tried to talk him out of it. Tried to convince him to just revise the damn report and keep his family safe, but he wouldn't hear of it. He did the right thing." "I know," Mia said, "but it cost him everything." Jim wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. "I've held on to that envelope for 60 years, hoping you'd turn up. I'm 93 years old. I was starting to think I wouldn't live long enough to keep my promise. But here you are. Finally. Vincent would have been so proud of you." Mira photographed every document before carefully returning the originals to Jim's care. "I need you to keep this safe for a little while longer," she said. "Once I bring down the Ashford family, this will all be evidence in a federal investigation. For now, it's safer here with you than anywhere else." Jim agreed, locking the envelope back in his desk drawer. "What are you going to do?" "Take it all to the FBI," she said, her voice resolute. "Prove what happened 60 years ago and what's happening now. I'm going to make sure the Ashfords finally pay for their crimes." From Jim's place, Mira drove to the FBI's regional office in downtown Missoula. The building was modern and anonymous, the kind of place that could house any number of government agencies. Inside, she asked to speak with someone about a cold case homicide connected to ongoing criminal activity. The agent who met her was a woman in her 40s named Sarah Cho, with sharp, perceptive eyes and the kind of careful attention that suggested she had heard many unlikely stories in her career. But as Mira laid out her evidence, the photographs, the documents, her father's letter, the proof of the illegal mining, Cho's expression shifted from polite skepticism to genuine interest. "This is 60 years of premeditated fraud," Cho murmured, examining the Ashford letter. "And if this illegal mining operation is as extensive as you describe, we're also dealing with current federal crimes. Theft of mineral rights, trespassing, possibly even racketeering, if we can establish a pattern of similar crimes. The Ashford family has been in the mineral rights business for decades," Mira said. "I'd be surprised if this was their only questionable acquisition." Cho took notes, asking detailed questions and making copies of everything Mira could provide. "I need to brief my supervisor," she said finally, "but I think we're going to want to move on this quickly. Can you show us the cave system and the mining operation?" "The workers were pulling out yesterday, but the evidence should still be there. Boreholes, equipment marks, ventilation shafts. I have photographs of everything before they started removing the equipment." "Excellent. We'll need you to guide us to the site. When can you be available?" "Whenever you need me. But there's something you should know. Roland Ashford knows I've been investigating. He's tried to buy me off, and he's tried to intimidate me. If he realizes I've gone to the feds, he might try to destroy the evidence. Or worse." Cho's expression hardened. "We'll move fast. Can you give us a few hours to mobilize a team? We'll meet you at your property this afternoon." Mira agreed, leaving the FBI office with a weight lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this anymore. She had federal backup, professional investigators, people with the authority and resources to see this through properly. But on the drive back to the cave house, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Ms. Delaney?" It was Roland Ashford, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We need to talk. I'm back at your property." There's been a development that changes everything. Call me back immediately." The call ended before she could reply. Mira's heart began to race. He was at her property now. He knew she'd been gone, and he was likely trying to figure out where she'd been and what she'd done. The FBI team was hours away. She would have to face him alone. But the cave house was her property, and she had a right to be there. More importantly, she couldn't let Roland remove evidence or do anything else to cover his tracks before the authorities arrived. Whatever he wanted to discuss, whatever new development he was referring to, she needed to face it head-on. She pulled over at a gas station and called the local sheriff's office, explaining that there was a trespasser on her property and she might require backup. The dispatcher promised to send a deputy, though it would take 45 minutes to reach the remote location. 45 minutes. The FBI would take at least 2 hours. For most of that time, Mira would be on her own, dealing with a man who had made it clear he wouldn't take no for an answer, whose family had a history of eliminating problems through violence. She checked that her hunting knife was secure on her belt, made sure her phone was fully charged, and headed into the mountains. The sun had passed its zenith, and the afternoon shadows were stretching long across the road. In a few hours, this would all be over. One way or another, the truth would finally come out. Justice would finally be served, and her father's murder, 60 years in the making, would finally be acknowledged. She just had to survive long enough to see it happen. Mira reached the cave house to find several vehicles parked in the clearing. Roland's SUV and 2 work trucks. She could hear voices coming from the cave entrance and see figures moving in the late afternoon shadows. They were loading equipment into the trucks with more urgency than organization. Crates of drilling gear, sample boxes, portable generators, everything they had been using for the illegal mining operation. They were cleaning out, likely planning to claim they had never been there if questioned. She parked down the road and approached on foot, staying in the tree line where she could observe without being seen immediately. She took a deep breath, then stepped out into the clearing. The activity stopped cold. All 3 men turned to look at her, surprise and calculation on their faces. "You're not taking any of this," Mira said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "This is my property, and everything here stays until the authorities arrive." Roland dropped the crate he was holding, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder. "Ms. Delaney, I told you we needed to talk. This is private property, yes, but you're interfering with a legal salvage operation. Recovery of equipment you illegally installed on my land? I don't think that's how it works." One of the workers, a burly man with a graying beard, spoke up. "Roland, if the cops are on the way, I'm gone. You didn't say anything about federal charges when you hired us." "Shut up and keep loading," Roland snapped, then turned back to Mira. "You've made a grave mistake. I tried to be reasonable. I tried to offer you fair compensation, but you insisted on making this difficult. Your grandfather murdered my father. There is no compensation for that. You can't prove a thing. Your father disappeared into the wilderness 60 years ago. People die in these mountains all the time. Accidents happen." "It wasn't an accident. I have the letter he wrote the day he died, explaining exactly what your grandfather did. I have your written bribe attempt. I have Silas Karn's statement about being threatened. I have everything I need to prove premeditated murder and conspiracy." Roland went very still. Impossible. Those documents were destroyed. My father made 3 copies. You found 1, maybe 2, but the 3rd was with someone your grandfather never knew. Someone who kept it safe for 60 years. And this morning, I handed everything over to the FBI. For the first time, Roland's composure shattered completely. His face flushed with rage, and he took a step toward her. "You stupid woman! Do you have any idea what you've done? My family built an empire over 3 generations. We have connections, resources, lawyers who can bury you in litigation for decades." "I'm 61 years old," Mira said, her voice unwavering. "I have time." She didn't move, refusing to show the fear that was coiling in her gut. She'd dealt with angry men before and knew that showing weakness only made things worse. "The FBI is on their way right now. They're going to document your illegal mining operation, seize your equipment as evidence, and start investigating your family's entire business history. When they're done, the name Ashford will be associated with murder and fraud, not mineral rights." Roland pulled out his phone and made a call. He had his back to her, speaking in a low voice, but Mira caught fragments. "I need you here now. Critical situation. Do whatever it takes." When he turned back, his expression was cold. "Here's what's going to happen. My men are going to finish loading this equipment and leave. You are going to stand here quietly until they're gone. And then you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about what happens next. The sheriff is already on his way, and the FBI will be here within 2 hours. You don't have time for whatever you're planning." "2 hours is plenty of time," Roland said, and nodded to his men. "Finish loading, quickly." The men resumed their activity, moving faster now, tossing equipment into the trucks with less care. One of them, the burly one, kept glancing at Mira, something like sympathy or guilt in his expression. Mira took out her phone and held it up so Roland could see. "I've recorded this entire conversation. Admissible proof of your illegal operation and your threats. You're making your situation worse with every word." Roland lunged toward her, fast enough that she had to take a step back. He tried to grab the phone, but she moved it out of his reach, backing toward the tree line. The workers stopped loading, watching the confrontation with uneasy expressions. "Give me that phone," Roland demanded. "Come near me again," Mira warned, her hand dropping to the knife on her belt. "And I'll use this. 30 years as a park ranger, I know how to handle myself in a physical confrontation." They stood there in a tense standoff, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped toward the mountains. In the distance, Mira heard the sound of a vehicle's engine. The sheriff's deputy, finally arriving. Roland heard it too. His jaw tightened, and he made a decision. "Load everything now. We're leaving." The workers threw the last few crates into the trucks, scrambling with obvious relief to get away from the confrontation. They climbed into their vehicles and started the engines. But Roland didn't move. He stood there staring at Mira, and in his eyes, she saw something that made her blood run cold. It wasn't anger anymore, but calculation. The look of someone deciding if eliminating a problem was worth the risk. "You should have taken the money," he said softly. "Your father should have revised his report. Some battles aren't worth fighting. My father thought otherwise. So do I." "Then you're both fools." The sound of the vehicle was getting closer, definitely coming up the mountain road. Roland finally moved toward his SUV, but slowly, as if still weighing his options. He opened the door, reached inside, and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. "You want the truth?" He walked back toward her, holding the book out. "Here's the truth. My grandfather kept detailed records, payments, dates, transactions, everything he did to build this business. June 17th, 1964. Payment for problem resolution, $5,000. June 23rd, final closure payment, $3,000. He threw the book at her feet. The dates match your father's disappearance and Karn's death exactly. My grandfather was a murderer, and I've known it for years. I found this after he died, read every entry, and understood exactly what kind of man he was. Mira picked up the ledger, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it to the pages Roland had mentioned. The entries were there, exactly as he'd described. Proof of payment for murder, written in clear accounting language, filed away like any other business expense. She looked up at him. Why are you showing me this? Because it doesn't matter anymore. You've already destroyed everything. The FBI will find this ledger when they search my estate, along with hundreds of other incriminating documents. The Ashford empire ends today, and it's your fault. The sheriff's cruiser came into view through the trees, its lights flashing. Roland got into his SUV and started the engine, but he rolled down the window and looked at her one last time. I hope you think it was worth it. Then he sped off, his workers' trucks following close behind, leaving Mira standing in the clearing with a leather-bound record of murder in her hands and the sound of approaching authority in the distance. The sheriff's deputy, who stepped out of the vehicle, was an older man with a weathered face and the calm demeanor of someone who had seen just about everything rural Montana had to offer. His name was Burke, and he listened to Mira's explanation with growing gravity. Ma'am, are you saying this Ashford fellow was running an illegal mine on your property? I have photographs of everything before they removed the equipment. More importantly, Mira showed him the ledger Roland had thrown at her feet. He just gave me his grandfather's personal accounting records. There are entries showing payments for murder dated to coincide with my father's disappearance and the death of Silas Karn in 1964. Burke took the ledger carefully, his expression darkening as he read the relevant pages. This is evidence in a historic homicide. I need to secure this and call in state investigators. The FBI, Mira said, the words feeling heavy and final, is already on the way.